The chandeliers sparkled like captured stars above the ballroom, their light bouncing off crystal glasses and sequined gowns as the guests raised toasts to the perfect couple. Lena Carter stood at the center of it all, her diamond ring catching the glow, her father's proud gaze fixed upon her as though she were a crown jewel to be displayed. The orchestra swelled, waiters glided between tables, and everyone's smiles shone as bright as the champagne in their flutes. But inside Lena, there was only unease, a whispering doubt she couldn't shake. Miles had been distracted all evening, his smile just a little too polished, his eyes wandering when he thought no one noticed. When her father pulled her into a circle of business allies, boasting about the merger this union would secure, Lena slipped away. The corridors of the hotel stretched quiet and hushed compared to the chaos of the party, her satin heels clicking on marble. She told herself she was only looking for a moment of air, a chance to breathe before her world closed in around her. But then she saw it, the light beneath the door of a private suite. Her hand shook as she pushed it open. The sight inside splintered her like glass against stone. Miles, her fiancé, the man who had slipped a ring onto her finger hours ago, stood with his hands tangled in the hair of her cousin Elise, their lips locked in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. The sound that tore from Lena's throat was soft but enough to make them break apart, both faces snapping toward her with matching horror. "Lena," Miles began, but she didn't wait. The door slammed behind her and she was running, her gown catching against the carpet, her breath coming in sharp, uneven sobs. The music from the ballroom echoed faintly down the hallway, cheerful and oblivious, while her world collapsed with every step. Out through the side exit she fled, out into the biting night where rain poured in heavy sheets. The city's glitter blurred through her tears as she stumbled into the storm, the cold soaking her gown, the veil clinging to her hair. The streets were nearly empty, slick with rain and shining like mirrors. Horns blared somewhere distant, but she heard nothing clearly. Each step was heavier, her chest tight with humiliation and rage. Her father's empire, her family's reputation, Miles's smirk, all of it pressed down until she could barely breathe. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't go back. Her vision swam as headlights suddenly flared against her, blinding in the rain. A sleek black car barreled toward her, tires screeching as it braked just in time. She stumbled backward, breath catching in her throat, her heart hammering with fresh terror. The passenger door swung open, and from the shadows of the car stepped a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coat whipping in the wind, he looked at her, not with annoyance but with piercing concern. The storm outlined his features, chiseled and stark, eyes as sharp as steel yet softened with something unexpected. "You'll be killed out here." His voice cut through the rain, low and commanding, as though he wasn't asking but insisting she come closer. Lena stood frozen, the storm battering her from all sides, her gown plastered to her skin, her heart still raw from betrayal. Yet something in his tone, something in the steadiness of his gaze, pierced the chaos inside her. She didn't know his name, or why fate had placed him in her path tonight. But as thunder roared and the rain came harder, she realized her life had just taken a turn she could never have imagined. And with one step toward him, everything she thought she knew began to unravel. Rain still poured in heavy sheets as Lena stood trembling on the deserted road, her gown clinging to her like a shroud of broken promises. The man's presence seemed to cut through the storm, solid and immovable, as if he belonged more to the night than to the world she had just fled. He moved closer, his dark coat soaked but his steps steady, unhurried, eyes never leaving hers. She could see now how sharply defined his features were, a mixture of danger and calm, the kind of face that belonged to someone used to control. Without asking permission, he slipped off the coat and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth startled her, seeping into her frozen skin, a reminder that she was still alive even though every part of her felt shattered. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. All she managed was a whisper. "I shouldn't be here." The stranger's gaze hardened, but his voice was quiet. "You shouldn't be anywhere near that storm you just came from. The road is worse than the rain. You'll come with me." It wasn't a suggestion. Before she could resist, a flash of headlights tore past them, a truck horn blaring as water sprayed up from the street. Her heart jolted, fear gripping her. In that instant, she realized she had no one else. The world she knew had just collapsed, and this stranger's car was the only shelter between her and the abyss. Inside the black luxury car, the silence pressed heavy. She sat with his coat around her, rain dripping from her hair, mascara streaking her cheeks. The leather seats smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, a scent both grounding and mysterious. He slid behind the wheel, his movements precise, controlled. Only when the car began to move did he finally glance at her again, his eyes reflecting the city's flashing lights. "You ran from something," he said. Not a question, just truth laid bare. Lena turned her face to the window, her throat tightening. She could still see Miles's hands in Elisa's hair, hear her father's proud voice announcing her engagement like a business deal. "My whole life," she murmured, "has been planned by other people. Tonight I saw it all for what it was. A lie." For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, maybe even pain. He didn't push her for more. Instead, he drove through the storm with quiet certainty, as though he had already decided she belonged under his protection. The city lights gave way to darkness, the car climbing higher, winding roads leading toward the cliffs where the world seemed to vanish into the sea. When the mansion came into view, her breath caught. Perched against the storm like a sentinel, its tall windows glowed with golden light. The gates opened silently at their approach, and the car rolled across a cobblestone drive slick with rain. She stepped out hesitantly, her heels slipping, but he was there, his hand steadying her before she could fall. Inside, warmth engulfed her. The grand hall stretched wide, lined with paintings that caught the firelight. The storm thundered outside, but here was silence, rich and strange. He watched her with a stillness that unsettled her more than the rain. "What is this place?" she whispered. "My house," he answered simply. "For tonight, yours too." His words struck her with confusing force. She should have demanded answers, demanded his name, demanded to know why fate had brought her here of all places. But exhaustion weighed her limbs, and something in his eyes silenced her questions. He was a stranger, yes, but one who felt oddly familiar in the way he carried his shadows. She didn't yet know his name was Adrian Blackwell. She didn't yet know why he lived alone in this fortress above the sea. All she knew was that the storm outside had delivered her into the hands of a man whose secrets would unravel everything she thought she understood about love, power, and trust. And as the lightning split the sky behind him, she realized with a shiver that her story was no longer her own. It had just entwined with his. The storm raged through the night, its echoes rattling against the tall glass windows of the mansion, but inside the silence was even louder. Lena stood in the middle of the grand hall, her soaked gown clinging to her skin, her heart still racing from everything she had left behind. The man who had brought her here had disappeared for a moment, leaving her surrounded by towering portraits and marble pillars that seemed to watch her every move. She wrapped his coat tighter around herself, the weight of it strange but strangely comforting. When he returned, he carried a tray with a steaming cup and a folded towel. He set them down without a word, his movements precise, controlled. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his briefly, and a spark shot through her, sharp enough to make her draw back. The heat of the tea seeped into her palms as she raised her eyes to him, finally daring to ask, "Who are you, Adrian Blackwell?" His voice was steady, deep, a name that seemed to carry weight. She recognized it, of course. Everyone in New York knew it. The billionaire no one saw. The man whispered about in hushed tones at her father's dinners. A man with money, power, and a reputation as untouchable as the cliffs his mansion stood upon. She should have been afraid, but instead she felt a strange pull. "What are you doing out here alone?" she asked, her voice still fragile. The faintest shadow crossed his face. "Alone is safer." Then his gaze locked on hers, sharp as glass. "And what about you, Miss Carter? Shouldn't you be celebrating a perfect engagement?" Her chest tightened at the sound of her name. "News travels fast," she whispered. "News doesn't need to travel." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Your eyes told me the moment I saw you, in the storm." Lena looked away, unable to hold that piercing gaze. The truth threatened to spill out of her, but she bit it back. She didn't owe this man her story. Not yet. Still, something inside her trembled at the thought that he had already seen more of her in one night than Miles had in years. Later, when exhaustion pulled at her body, Adrian led her to a guest room. The space was vast, with high ceilings and a bed draped in ivory linens. But it wasn't the luxury that made her pause. It was the wall of photographs that caught her attention. Black and white images of people, places, moments frozen in time. Children laughing, an old woman's hands weaving, a storm rolling over an empty field. Each picture carried raw truth, captured without polish, without pretense. She turned slowly, realizing these weren't decorations bought at an auction. They were his. "You took these?" she asked softly. For the first time, his mask slipped. A flicker of vulnerability passed through his eyes. "Yes." Something in her chest cracked open at the admission. This man, hidden away in a fortress of wealth, carried within him a soul that saw the world differently, a soul that searched for meaning beyond power and money. But before she could say anything more, a loud crack of thunder shook the glass. The lights flickered. Adrian's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the hall, his expression darkening in a way that made her pulse quicken. "This storm isn't what worries me," he murmured. Fear and curiosity twined together in Lena's chest. What did he mean? What danger could reach them here, in a mansion carved into the cliffs above the sea? She didn't know, but as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while the storm battered the walls, she understood one thing. Her life had collided with Adrian Blackwell's for a reason, and whatever secrets lived within these walls, they were about to change everything she thought she knew about survival, about trust, and about herself. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the cliffs shrouded in mist, but inside the mansion the air still carried a tension that refused to lift. Lena wandered through long corridors lined with books and paintings, every corner whispering of a life she didn't yet understand. The photographs she had seen the night before stayed with her. They weren't the work of a man hiding from the world. They were the work of someone who had seen too much of it. She found Adrian in the library, standing before a fire that glowed faintly in the gray light. He was holding a glass of water, staring into the flames as if they carried memories he couldn't put down. She almost turned back, but then his voice carried across the room, low and certain. "You didn't sleep." She froze, realizing he had heard her footsteps even on the thick carpet. "I couldn't," she admitted, stepping closer. "Too much in my head." Adrian's eyes shifted to her, and for a moment she felt pinned in place. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." It wasn't a command meant to dominate. It was spoken with a weight that suggested he wasn't used to asking twice. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. For a long moment he said nothing, only watching her. Then he spoke quietly, as though each word was carved from something deeper. "You think I brought you here because of the storm, but storms don't scare me. I've lived through worse." Lena tilted her head, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" His jaw tightened, his gaze hardening like stone. "Years ago, I was engaged. She left me hours before the wedding. Took everything she could. Money, information, trust." He paused, his voice growing rougher. "The betrayal wasn't the worst part. It was realizing I never really knew her." Lena's throat closed. The words struck far too close to her own wound, and since then she whispered, "Since then, I've learned to Build walls that no one can climb. Silence settled, heavy with truths unspoken. Lena's chest ached with the weight of it, the pain in his voice echoing her own. But she also sensed something dangerous beneath his confession, a man who had vowed never to be weak again. Before she could respond, a knock shattered the stillness. Adrian's shoulders stiffened. A tall man entered, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a problem." Lena glanced between them, confusion flooding her. Adrian didn't flinch, his composure steady. "Speak." "It's about Miss Carter. Reporters are circling the cliffs. Someone tipped them off. They know she's here." Lena's breath caught, her heart lurching. Her father's reach stretched further than she had feared. Adrian turned his gaze to her, unreadable, but she felt the weight of it like fire. "You thought you ran from them," he said slowly, "but they've already followed you here." Her pulse thundered in her ears as realization struck. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The ringing of her phone shattered the tense silence. Lena pulled it from her pocket with trembling hands, the screen glowing with her father's name. For a moment she thought of ignoring it, but Adrian's steady gaze made her answer. The voice on the other end was sharp and calculated, laced with fury beneath a veneer of concern. "Lena, where are you? Do you understand what you've done?" She bit back a sob. "What I've done, Father. I walked in on Miles with Elise, and you still expect me to stand in front of the world and pretend." Her father's voice grew colder. "Appearances matter more than truth. The press is already circling. Your silence makes you look unstable. Miles is playing the victim. If you don't come home now, I'll have no choice but to declare you unfit to handle your shares." Lena's knees weakened, but Adrian stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly against hers, grounding her. She drew in a shaky breath. "I'm not unstable," she whispered into the phone. "I'm done being your pawn." She ended the call before her father could reply, her chest heaving with a mixture of fear and newfound defiance. Adrian took the phone gently from her trembling hand. "They won't stop. Your father knows your worth isn't just in money. It's in control." Her eyes burned. "He'll do anything to silence me." Adrian's expression darkened. "Then maybe it's time you stop running and start fighting." Before she could respond, raised voices echoed from outside the mansion. Adrian's staff rushed in. "Sir, the reporters have broken past the gates. Someone guided them here. They know about Miss Carter." Lena's heart pounded. Her father's manipulations stretched further than she had imagined. Adrian's jaw tightened as he turned to her. "You have two choices. You can walk out and face them on his terms, let his lies define you, or you can stand with me, and we expose the truth on yours." Fear warred wit, with determination in her chest. She had never stood against her father before, never dared. But the thought of going back into that world, forced into silence, forced into a marriage built on betrayal, made her stomach twist. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered. Adrian's eyes softened for the first time since the storm. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's standing while terrified. And I've seen enough in you to know you can. The sudden crash of glass startled them both. A rock had been hurled through one of the tall windows, landing at Lena's feet with a scrap of paper tied around it. Her fingers shook as she untied the message. The words were scrawled in her father's familiar hand. "Come home now, or you'll regret it." Her blood ran cold, the weight of the threat pressing down on her. She lifted her eyes to Adrian, who had already picked up the rock, his jaw set like steel. "You're not going back alone," he said. "Whatever game your father is playing, it ends now." For the first time, Lena believed it might be possible. Not safe, not easy, but possible. The storm she had fled had only grown larger, but at her side stood a man who didn't flinch in the face of it. And as the mansion filled with the echo of shouting voices outside, Lena realized her battle was no longer about a broken engagement. It was about freedom, truth, and the courage to finally take back her life. The night after the stone crashed through the window stretched long and sleepless. Lena stood at the balcony of the guest room, staring at the restless waves smashing against the cliffs below. Every breath of wind seemed to carry her father's voice, every crash of thunder the echo of his threat. She clutched the vintage coat Adrian had given her, the weight of it anchoring her when everything else felt like it was slipping away. At dawn, she found Adrian in his private study. The room was different from the grand library, stripped of elegance, filled instead with files, maps, and monitors that hummed softly. His back was to her, broad shoulders tense as he scanned a glowing screen. When he turned, his expression carried both steel and exhaustion. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said quietly. "Your father is calling for an emergency board session tomorrow. He's using a medical report to claim you're unstable, unfit to manage your shares." Lena felt her chest tighten. "A medical report? That's impossible. I've never even been examined." Adrian slid a folder across the desk. Inside were forged documents bearing her name, a psychiatrist's signature she had never seen, and notes about her being emotionally erratic, prone to breakdowns. Each page was a lie crafted to strip her voice away. Her hands shook. "How did you get this?" His gaze didn't waver. "I have people who owe me favors, and I've dealt with men like your father before. He builds power by destroying anyone who threatens his control." Anger flared hot in her veins, pushing past fear. "My own father is willing to erase me on paper just to keep hold of a company." Adrian stepped closer, his voice low and deliberate. "He doesn't see you as a daughter. He sees you as an asset, and the more you resist, the more dangerous he becomes." The words cut deep, but so did the truth she couldn't ignore. For the first time, she looked at Adrian not just as a stranger who had taken her in, but as a man who understood the cruelty of betrayal on a level that matched her own. Before she could speak, an alarm on one of the monitors shrilled. Adrian strode back to the desk, his hands flying across the controls. A grainy feed appeared on the screen showing black SUVs parked just beyond the gates of the estate. Men in suits stepped out, their movements too coordinated to be mere reporters. Lena's stomach dropped. "Who are they?" His jaw tightened. "Not press. Hired security. Your father's men." Her pulse hammered in her ears. "He sent them for me." Adrian turned, his eyes locking on hers with fierce intensity. "He wants to bring you back under his control before tomorrow's board meeting. But he won't get the chance." Lena's breath hitched. "And if they force their way in, then they'll learn that I don't let anyone take what's under my protection." There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty, the kind of certainty born from battles already fought and scars carried in silence. In that moment, Lena felt the storm shift inside her. Fear remained, but it was no longer the kind that paralyzed. It sharpened her, steeled her. She straightened, her voice steadier than she expected. "Then we fight back. Not with guns or fists. With truth. If my father wants to paint me as unstable, I'll show the world exactly who he really is." Adrian studied her, something new flickering in his gaze. Pride, perhaps even hope. The faintest ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we'll do it together." As the storm clouds gathered again over the sea and the black cars waited like predators beyond the gates, Lena realized her life was no longer about fleeing. The girl who ran in the rain was gone. The woman standing here had fire in her veins and a man at her side who believed in her strength. And for the first time, she was as ready to face the war her father had started. The morning of the board meeting arrived wrapped in tension, thick enough to choke. Lena stood before a mirror in Adrian's mansion, her reflection almost unrecognizable. Gone was the trembling runaway in a ruined gown. In her place stood a woman dressed in sleek black, her hair pulled back, eyes sharpened by fire. She fastened the coat Adrian had given her, its weight a reminder of the night everything had begun. For a heartbeat she hesitated, but then Adrian appeared in the doorway, his presence steady and commanding. "They will be waiting to tear you apart," he said, voice low but unwavering. "They'll try to rattle you. Your father thrives on fear. Don't give it to him." Lena nodded, her fingers tightening at her sides. I'm done being silent. The drive into Manhattan was a blur of gray skies and city noise, every block carrying her closer to the battlefield. Outside Carver Tower, reporters swarmed like vultures, their microphones thrust forward, their questions sharp as knives. Adrian stepped out first, his tall frame cutting through the chaos, his hand reaching back for hers. The moment their fingers laced together, the crowd erupted, cameras flashing like lightning. Inside the boardroom, the air was colder than the rain outside. Her father sat at the head of the table, every silver strand of hair perfectly combed, his expression carved from stone. Beside him was Miles, immaculate in his suit, his eyes flicking toward her with false concern. The board members murmured in low voices, their gazes sharp with curiosity and judgment. Lena walked to her seat, spine straight, every step echoing with defiance. Adrian stood at the far end, silent but unyielding, his eyes locked on her father like a predator circling prey. Her father's voice sliced through the tension. My daughter has been through an emotional episode. For her own protection and for the stability of Carver. Media, I've had her evaluated by a licensed professional. The psychiatrist's report, he said, sliding the forged document across the polished wood, confirms she is unfit to manage her shares. Effective immediately, her voting power transfers to me. A hush fell across the room. Lena's chest burned, but she didn't falter. With calm precision, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder of her own. Her voice carried clear and unwavering. This report is a lie. I have evidence proving my father commissioned a fraudulent evaluation. And more than that, evidence of his financial misconduct over the past 5 years. Gasps rippled through the room as she laid out documents Adrian's team had uncovered. Offshore accounts, hidden transfers, forged signatures. Her father's composure cracked, his face reddening as board members whispered urgently to one another. Miles leaned forward, his mask slipping into panic. You dare disgrace me like this, her father spat, his voice trembling with fury. After everything I've built. Lena met his gaze without flinching. You didn't build a legacy. You built a cage. And I won't live in it any longer. The room erupted in noise, but over it all Lena heard Adrian's voice, steady and resolute. The truth has a way of burning through lies, Gideon. And your daughter has finally found her fire. Her father slammed a fist on the table, but the power he had clung to for decades was slipping, crumbling like ash in the wind. The board members no longer looked to him with loyalty. They looked at Lena, and for the first time she saw respect in their eyes. As security stepped into the room, not for her, but for him, Lena felt the storm inside her finally break. Her father's empire had been built on fear, but her voice, her truth, had just struck the first blow to bring it down. And standing across the room, watching with fierce pride, Adrian Blackwell K. knew this was only the beginning. The boardroom fractured into chaos after Lena's words. Voices clashed across the long table, some shouting for order, others demanding immediate action. Her father's face was a mask of fury, his hand still pressed flat against the polished wood as though sheer force could hold together the empire crumbling beneath him. Miles leaned close to Gideon, whispering urgently, but the older man shoved him back with a snarl that cut through the noise. Security lingered by the door, uncertain who they were meant to remove. The board members, sensing the tide shifting, demanded time to review the documents Lena had presented. A vote was called, but Gideon refused to recognize it, declaring the meeting illegitimate. He stormed from the room, Miles scrambling after him, their footsteps echoing down the marble corridor like thunder. Adrian crossed to Lena's side, his presence steady. You stood against him without trembling, he murmured. That's more than half the battle won. But Lena's chest was still tight, her hands trembling despite her outward calm. He won't stop, she whispered. You saw his eyes. He'll find another way to silence me. Adrian's jaw tightened. Then we stay ahead of him. They left the tower through a side entrance, avoiding the mob of reporters waiting in front. A black car whisked them through the rain-slick streets of Manhattan, but instead of taking her back to the mansion, Adrian gave the driver an address Lena didn't recognize. The car stopped before an unmarked building in Chelsea. Inside, Lena found herself in a room filled with screens, files, and maps pinned across walls. It looked less like an office and more like a war room. "This is where I fight the battles no one sees," Adrian explained. "And this time, you're not my responsibility. You're my ally." Her pulse quickened. Ally. Not asset, not pawn, not daughter of Gideon Carter. For the first time, Yon saw her as equal. But then one of Adrian's men rushed in, holding a tablet. "Sir, we intercepted communication between Gideon and Miles. They're preparing to move funds out of the country. They're planning to disappear before the authorities can act." Lena's stomach dropped. If he runs, he'll take everything with him. The archives, the accounts, the power to ruin what's left of Carver Media. Adrian studied her carefully. "Then we stop him before he has the chance." The plan was reckless. Lena knew it. But hours later, she found herself walking into her father's private penthouse once again, Adrian at her side. The air inside was heavy with tension, curtains drawn, the city lights muted beyond the glass. Gideon sat waiting, his posture rigid, a decanter of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. Miles stood in the shadows, his eyes darting between Lena and Adrian like a man cornered. "You think you've won because of some papers and accusations?" Gideon said, his voice rough with controlled rage. "But you've underestimated me, Lena. You've always underestimated me." She stepped forward, refusing to be cowed. "No, Father. I finally see you clearly. That's the difference." His lips curled into a bitter smile. "Then see this." With a snap of his fingers, two men emerged from the side hallway, large and cold-eyed, blocking the exit. Adrian moved subtly in front of her, his body a shield. Lena's breath caught as the weight of danger pressed in. Her father's voice dropped low. "You don't get to destroy me, Lena. Not you, not him. If I fall, I'll take you with me." The storm outside lashed harder against the glass, thunder cracking like judgment itself. And in that moment, Lena understood that the battle had shifted. This was no longer about shares or companies or even reputations. This was survival. And the man at her side, who had once been a stranger in the storm, was now the only person standing between her and the darkness her father had unleashed. The room held its breath as Gideon's men stepped closer, their heavy footsteps echoing like drums of war. Lena's pulse hammered in her ears, but she stood tall behind Adrian, refusing to let fear drag her back into silence. Adrian's voice cut through the tension, calm and sharp as steel. "Careful, Gideon. Threatening your own daughter in front of witnesses is a mistake even you can't spin." Her father's lips curved into a cold smile. "Witnesses don't matter when power decides the story. And power is still mine." Adrian's gaze didn't waver. Not anymore. With a subtle gesture, he pulled a small device from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. A green light blinked once before steadying. Lena's eyes widened as realization struck. He had been recording since the moment they walked in. Every threat, every word her father had spoken was now evidence. Gideon's face blanched for the first time, fury flashing in his eyes. Miles stepped forward quickly, desperation in his voice. "Gideon, stop this. If you push too far, you'll bury us both." But Gideon shoved him aside, his voice rising with venom. "You betrayed me when you sided with her. You're nothing without me." The glass doors rattled as another boom of thunder rolled across the city. Lena found her courage, her voice cutting clear. "No, Father, he's nothing with you. But with the truth, even Miles has more than you ever did." The board had been fractured. The authorities were already circling. But Gideon still had men at his command, still had the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He turned toward Adrian with fire in his gaze. "You think rescuing her from a storm makes you a savior? You're just another man trying to own what isn't yours." Adrian took a step forward, his presence towering. "I don't own her. I stand with her. And that's something you'll never understand." The tension snapped. "Gideon's me," and advanced. Adrian moved faster than Lena thought possible, disarming one with a sharp twist, sending the man crashing into the glass wall. The second lunged, but Adrian met him head-on, the struggle fierce and brutal. Lena darted forward, grabbing the recording device before the chaos could shatter it. Miles, pale and shaking, pressed himself against the wall, torn between fear and loyalty. When the last man hit the floor, groaning in defeat, Adrian straightened, his breath heavy but controlled. Gideon's mask had finally cracked. His complexion was ashen, sweat beating at his temple, his hands shaking not with anger this time, but with something deeper. He clutched his chest, stumbling back into the chair. Father Lena cried out, rushing to his side. For a moment the tyrant was gone, leaving only a frail man gasping for air. His eyes locked on hers, wild with fear. "Don't let them. Take it from me." His voice broke as he struggled for breath. Paramedics were called, Miles fumbling with his phone, his face stricken. Adrian guided Lena back as they worked to stabilize Gideon, but her heart was torn in two. This was the man who had betrayed her, controlled her, threatened her. Yet in that moment of weakness, he was also her father, fragile and human. As they wheeled Gideon out, Miles caught her arm, his voice raw. "He's not the only one who will fall, Lena. If you go through with this, the whole empire crumbles. Everything your family built will turn to ash." Lena looked at him, rain streaking the glass behind her, lightning splitting the sky. Then let it burn, because what's built on lies should never have stood at all. Adrian's hand found hers, warm and unyielding. For the first time, she felt the weight of choice fully in her grasp. The storm outside raged louder, but inside her, clarity cut through. The empire her father had built was dying. What she and Adrian were about to build was only beginning. The city was alive with the sound of sirens and the echo of thunder as Lena stood at the edge of the boardroom, her gown still damp from the storm, her heart pounding with a rhythm that felt like destiny itself. Hours had passed since her father was rushed to the hospital, but the weight of his empire still hung heavy in the air. The board members, restless and divided, whispered among themselves, eyes darting between her and Adrian as if waiting for one of them to claim the throne. Adrian stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the room. "You've all heard the truth. The recordings are in safe hands. Gideon's corruption has already been handed to the authorities. This company has a choice now, to be dragged down with him or to rebuild with integrity." The words struck like steel, and the silence that followed was more powerful than the thunder outside. Lena could feel every eye on her. She was no longer the runaway bride hiding in shadows. She was the heir, the woman who had bled for truth and been reborn in the fire of betrayal. She lifted her chin, her voice clear and unwavering. Carver Media belongs to the truth, to the stories that matter, not to corruption, not to lies, and not to fear. If you choose me, I won't be a puppet. I will rebuild this company with transparency, with integrity, and with the strength to face what my father could not. For a moment, no one moved. Then one by one, board members rose, pledging their support. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. The tide had shifted. Miles sat slumped in the corner, his face pale as realization crashed over him. His game was lost, his mask shattered. But even in victory, Lena felt no triumph, only clarity. Her father's empire was ashes, but from it, something new would rise. When the meeting ended, Adrian guided her outside into the storm's aftermath. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, the cedars, trees glistening with reflections of neon lights. She leaned against him, exhaustion threatening to consume her, but his strength steadied her. "You did it," he said softly, pride burning in his eyes. "We did it," she corrected, her voice trembling with relief. But Adrian wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that seemed impossibly out of place after everything they'd just endured. Lena's breath caught as he dropped to one knee right there on the rain-soaked pavement, the city humming around them, the storm clouds parting to reveal the first glimmer of dawn. "Lena Carter, you ran into my life in a storm, broken but unyielding. From that moment, I knew you weren't just someone I wanted to protect. You were someone I couldn't imagine life without. You showed me what love is when it's real, when it's raw, when it's worth fighting for. His voice cracked, vulnerability shining through the strength. I don't want a throne. I don't want an empire. I want you. Will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision as the city lights shimmered like stars. She thought of her father, her cousin, the shattered illusions of her past, and then of this man who had stood beside her in every storm. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands cupping his face. Yes, Adrian. 1,000 times yes. The kiss that followed wasn't just passion, it was promise. A vow that no storm, no betrayal, no empire could ever break them again. Months later, the world would speak of the Carver-Vance Foundation, a partnership that rebuilt Carver Media into a beacon of truth while funneling millions into arts, education, and innovation. But for Lena and Adrian, the story was simpler. It began with a storm, with a runaway bride, with a stranger's hand reaching out in the darkness. And it ended not with power seized or wealth secured, but with love that defied every obstacle. Yea, with two souls who found their home not in palaces or boardrooms, but in each other. And as they stood together on the balcony of their new foundation headquarters, watching a storm roll harmlessly across the skyline, Lena whispered the truth she had finally come to believe. The storm didn't break me. It led me to you. Adrian kissed her hair, his arms wrapping her close, and with the city below them and the horizon ahead, they knew their story had only just begun.